Hi guys! Today I'm showing you how I made these super cute snowman containers from start to finish. I started making these snowmen like this last year and I have a video about them that I'll put in the comments. But this year I made some big improvements, so I wanted to share my updated design. We've gotten about 6 inches of snow at my house this week, so it's a good time to talk about snowmen. Just like any other pottery project, this one started out with me weighing and wedging the clay. I weighed out a larger amount of clay for the snowman's body and a smaller amount of clay for the snowman's hat. I also weighed out a ball of clay around 1 pound for another part of this project, which I'll get into a bit later. Wedging clay when it's straight out of the bag isn't strictly necessary since it already comes homogenized and ready. However, I find it helpful in getting the clay into a ball shape and ready to throw, so I typically wedge a bit even if it's right out of the bag. Then it was on to one of my very favorite parts, throwing on the wheel. I threw the snowmen bodies first so I could fit the hats to them later on. I threw the bodies just like I do with bubble vases. I center the clay, open it up, pull up the walls with a few pulls, and then add a foot. I added the foot by using a credit card that I had cut a notch out of to shape the foot while I throw. This technique works great and looks good, and I don't have to do any trimming. I don't really mind trimming, but it is time consuming, so if I can skip it here and there, it's a good thing. Then I shape the bubbles by pushing the clay out from the inside and then refining the bubbles from the outside. I then give the bubbles some definition by pushing in the area between the bubbles. I've tried several different tools for this part, but I've found that just using the side of my finger works the best for me. Then I measured the opening at the top of the snowman and repeated the same process over and over, each time trying to make the opening at the top the same as the others. I didn't worry about the height or width so much, as I think the differences add character to the final pieces, but I wanted the rim to have about the same diameter for each piece to make sizing the hats easier later. Then it was on to throwing the hats. I really love the look of these little guys with their top hats. And then the hats also double as a lid for the container, so that's really fun too. The hats are super simple. They're thrown upside down by making a cylinder and then just folding over the rim at a right angle. I tried to get the opening to the hat about the same diameter as the rim of the snowman. You'll note I say about the same and not exactly the same because it's hard to get them perfect, and it all works out later. I don't shoot for perfect in my studio, or really even my life for that matter. I go for darn good, and that's good enough. I also threw a plain cylinder about the diameter of the snowman rims with that extra piece of clay I wedged out, which I'll explain more in a moment. After all the snowman pieces were thrown, I let them dry to leather hard. They look kind of funny just as the unfinished pieces, but it'll all come together later. After they firmed up a bit, I got to work on completing the hats, and this is where that plain cylinder comes in. I cut the cylinder into about half-inch pieces and then smoothed the cylinder again before cutting the next piece. This left me with several rings that were smooth on one end. Then I took the freshly cut rings and added them to the hat to make a flange that fits down into the top of the snowman's head. This is one of the main improvements I made versus last year's snowman. With the flange on the hat rather than on the snowman's head like last year, it looks better and the snow hat stays on more securely too. Once the flange was added, I colored the hat and the flange and the rim with black slip. I made this by adding water and black mason stain to some dried clay straps, letting the clay slake and then blending it all together. I recently bought an immersion blender for my studio and it works great for making slip. I also added colored slip to the outside of the hats later after the inside slip dried more. At this point, I finished up the snowman details in 2 different ways. For most of the snowmen, I added white underglaze before the face and arm details, so the details have the color showing, but for some of the snowmen, I added the details first and then added the white underglaze over the top for a more monochromatic look. Whether put on before or after the underglaze was added, the arm, face, and button details were all added in the same way. For the eyes, mouth, and buttons, I used more of that black-colored slip that I'd used for the hat, but this time in a squeeze bottle for the fine details. Then, for the arms and carrot nose, I used slip from a reddish-brown clay body. It looks pretty vibrant to start out with, but looks more brown when fired. I kind of meant to go back and add some orange glaze to just the carrot nose, but that didn't happen. I still like the slightly more 3D look to the details that I did this year, as opposed to the more flat details that I did this year. And hey, this method actually ended up being easier anyway. Now that the snowman bodies were ready to dry, I put the finishing touches on the hat. I used a rasp and a sponge to trim and then smooth the top edge of the hat. And then I added the black slip on the outside of the hat. And hey, it looks like a real top hat now. Then I left them alone to dry completely, which always takes longer in colder weather, but eventually they were dry and I bisque fired them. Since they had no glaze at this point, I fired them with their cute hats on to save space in my kiln. Then it was time for glazing. I made this part really easy by already adding the colors on the details with the slips as I was making them. All they needed was a simple layer of glaze and they were all ready to go. If you've watched any of my other videos having to do with glazing, you'll know I'm not fond of brush-on glazes. They can be really gorgeous and get some great glazing effects, but I just don't have the patience for that. Which probably sounds kind of funny coming from me after explaining all the other long steps up to this point, but those steps are fun and glazing is not. I used some blue dipping glaze that I had purchased for the inside of the snowman bodies. I just poured the glaze in, made sure it got all over the inside, and then poured it out. And I did this step first, as I always end up getting some of the glaze on the outside of the piece, so I wiped that off. I've started mixing my own glazes recently, and so for the outside of the snowman and the outside of their hats, I dipped the pieces into a clear glaze that I'd mixed up. That gray rectangle that's on the table that I'm putting the pieces onto is a piece of damp carpet. So that sounds kind of weird, but it actually works awesome for wiping off the bottom of my pieces. And then I just double check the bottoms with a sponge and they're ready to go. If pieces have any glaze on the bottom of them, they'll stick to the kiln shelf and be ruined. So cleaning off the bottoms is a very important step. Then it was time for the final firing. This time I fired the hats and the snowmen separately because otherwise the glaze would fuse the hats to the snowmen, and I want them to be decorative containers and not just be decorative. After the glaze firing, they were all looking so good. This guy could wear this hat. I love it with the hats. They look so much cuter with the hats. Love it. There were no cracks, explosions, or anything of the sort. I was on a bit of a short deadline with these since I was trying to finish them before the markets that I did before Christmas. They were well received at the markets and quite a few of them sold. And a lot of them were greatly admired. There was one final detail I added to these snowmen before they were ready for their new homes though. Last year I had added a thin stripe of red glaze on the hat of the snowman I had made. And it was a good idea, but the line wasn't quite straight and it was hard to get it right. So this year, when they were all done in the kiln, I added a fabric red ribbon with a bow to the hats. The ribbon was just tied around so it could be removed if a plain black hat was wanted instead, but I really liked the added color of the red ribbon. It makes the snowman a bit more fun. So there they are, all fully finished and looking all dressed up in their black top hats. You can see the two kinds next to each other now, the fully white snowman and the ones with the arms and face with some color. Which type of snowman do you prefer? Please let me know in the comments. And be sure to check out this video of me making clay ducks, taking them on vacation, and then hiding them on a cruise ship. It was quite an adventure, so don't miss that video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.